To the surprise of many, the United States is actually the world's largest oil producer. That's right. Bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Russia, and bigger than any of the countries people usually associate with massive oil production. And here's where it gets even more interesting. In the past year alone, the US produced an average of 21 million barrels of petroleum per day. At the same time, Americans only consumed about 20 million barrels per day. That means, in theory, there's more than enough oil being pumped out of US soil to cover the country's entire energy needs. Yet, despite this, the US still imports millions of barrels of oil from other countries. In fact, a big chunk of those imports come from OPEC nations, the same group of oil-producing countries that are famous for controlling global supply and prices. So that raises a big question. If the US produces enough oil to be self-sufficient, why does it continue to rely on foreign oil? Why does America still import oil from the Middle East, from Venezuela, from Canada? And on top of that, why does the US export so much of its own oil while still buying from other countries? If the goal is energy independence, wouldn't it make more sense to keep American oil in America? This is where things start to get complicated. The oil industry doesn't work in the way most people assume. It's not as simple as, we produce oil, so we use our own oil. The reality is shaped by a mix of history, global politics, economic strategy, and even the specific types of oil being pumped out of the ground. So, let's take a step back and break down the paradox of American oil. First, we need to address the fact that the US is the biggest oil producer despite not having the largest oil reserves. When people think about oil-rich nations, the first places that come to mind are usually countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Venezuela, and that makes sense because when it comes to total oil reserves, the amount of oil still left underground, the US doesn't even make it into the top 10. According to the latest data, the United States has about 36.5 billion barrels of oil in its reserves. That might sound like a lot, but in comparison, Venezuela, the country with the largest oil reserves, has around 302.8 billion barrels. That's nearly 10 times more oil than the US. Other countries like Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran also have significantly larger reserves. So how is the US able to outproduce countries that have way more oil? The answer lies in the way oil is extracted and the way different countries manage their oil supplies. The US doesn't follow the same strategy as countries like Saudi Arabia. While the Middle Eastern oil giants have massive reserves, they don't just pump out as much oil as they can every single day. Instead, they carefully control production to make sure they don't flood the market and drive prices down. For countries like Saudi Arabia, oil isn't just a resource, it's their entire economy. A huge chunk of their government revenue comes from selling oil, so if oil prices drop too much, their entire economy takes a hit. This is why OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, exists. It's basically a group of oil-producing nations that work together to control supply and keep prices at a level that benefits them. And this strategy works. Just take a look at Saudi Arabia's economy over time. The country's GDP moves almost perfectly in sync with global oil prices. When oil prices go up, the economy thrives. When oil prices crash, the economy struggles. Because of this, Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations have to be extremely careful about how much oil they put on the market. The US, on the other hand, plays by a completely different set of rules. America isn't trying to keep oil prices high. It's actually the opposite. The US is a massive consumer of oil, which means it benefits from lower prices. Americans love their cars, their trucks, their air conditioning, their cheap flights, and all of that runs on oil. So for the US, keeping oil prices low is actually a good thing. That's why, instead of limiting production, the US has done the exact opposite. It's aggressively exploited its oil reserves, producing as much as possible to flood the market and drive prices down. This strategy, combined with major advancements in oil extraction technology, is what has made the US the largest oil producer in the world, despite having a much smaller reserve base. A big part of this production boom is due to a controversial technique known as fracking. Fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, has allowed American oil companies to tap into reserves that were previously too difficult or expensive to extract. This has played a huge role in making the US an oil powerhouse. But even though the US produces a lot of oil today, that wasn't always the case. If we look back at history, we can start to understand why the US is still so dependent on foreign oil, despite its current production capabilities. In the early 1900s, oil wasn't nearly as important as it is today. Most of the world was still running on coal, and there wasn't a massive need for petroleum. But then, everything changed. The lead up to World War I created a huge demand for oil. Compared to coal, petroleum had a major advantage. It was easier to transport, and it could be used in different types of vehicles, including warships and tanks. The US quickly realized that controlling oil meant controlling power. The American military, particularly the Navy, began securing oil supplies from Mexico and the Caribbean. But then, things took a turn. During the war, German U-boats started attacking oil shipments, disrupting the supply chain. This forced the US to start looking inward, leading to a massive push to explore and extract domestic oil. This was a turning point. The government poured resources into oil production, and before long, states like Texas, Oklahoma, and California were booming with oil wells. By 1914, the US was producing around 70% of the world's total oil supply. And then came the next big shift, the realization that oil wasn't just for war. It was about mobility, industry, and the future of transportation. One of the moments that really cemented this idea happened in 1919 when a group of US military members, including a young Dwight D. Eisenhower, embarked on a cross-country journey to assess the state of American roads. What they found was shocking. Most roads in the US were in terrible shape. The expedition averaged a travel speed of just 5 miles per hour, and the entire trip was a logistical nightmare. Eisenhower saw firsthand how transportation, national security, and oil were all connected. Years later, when he became president, he would push for the construction of the interstate highway system, something that would forever change how Americans used oil. Meanwhile, around the world, other countries were catching on to just how valuable oil was going to be. European powers, including Britain and the Netherlands, started aggressively expanding their oil operations in the Middle East and beyond. The global scramble for oil was in full swing. As the US economy grew, so did its need for oil. But instead of relying solely on domestic production, the US started looking for cheaper foreign oil. And that's where its dependence on foreign oil really started. The United States might be the biggest oil producer in the world, but that doesn't mean it has an unlimited supply of oil. In fact, when we look at global oil reserves, the picture changes completely. Most people assume that the biggest oil producers are also the ones sitting on the largest reserves. It makes sense, right? If a country is pumping out millions of barrels a day, it should mean they have an enormous underground supply to pull from. But the reality is that's not how it works. The US, despite being the #1 producer, only has about 36.5 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's a lot, but it's nowhere near what some other countries have. To put things in perspective, Venezuela has about 302.8 billion barrels, almost 10 times what the US has. Saudi Arabia has around 267 billion barrels. Even Canada, a country with a fraction of America's population, has roughly 168 billion barrels of oil in its reserves. So how does the US manage to outproduce countries that have way more oil? The answer comes down to a combination of technology, policy, and a fundamental difference in how the US treats its oil reserves compared to other countries. Let's start with technology. The oil industry isn't just about finding oil, it's about getting it out of the ground in the most efficient way possible. Some oil reserves are relatively easy to access. The oil sits in large underground pools, and all companies need to do is drill down, pump it up, and refine it. This is the kind of oil that places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela have in abundance. The US, on the other hand, has a different kind of oil. A lot of it is trapped in shale rock formations, which means it isn't just sitting there waiting to be pumped. It requires a much more complex extraction process, and that's where fracking comes in. Fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, is a method where water, sand, and chemicals are injected into rock formations at high pressure to break them apart and release oil and natural gas. This technique has completely changed the game for US oil production. Before fracking became widespread, much of America's oil was considered too difficult or expensive to extract. Now, thanks to advancements in drilling technology, the US can produce more oil than ever before, even though it doesn't have the same level of reserves as other oil-rich nations. But technology alone doesn't explain why the US is producing so much oil. It also comes down to policy. The US government doesn't operate the same way as many of the oil-producing countries in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, for example, doesn't just pump oil whenever it wants. It carefully controls production to maintain stable prices. If too much oil is released into the market, prices crash. If supply is tightened, prices rise. This is how OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, operates. It's essentially a cartel made up of the world's biggest oil producers, and its main goal is to regulate supply to keep prices in a range that benefits its member countries. The US, however, doesn't follow this strategy. Unlike Saudi Arabia, oil in the US isn't controlled by the government. Instead, it's produced by private companies that operate based on supply and demand. If oil prices are high, companies pump more oil because it's more profitable. If prices drop, production slows down. The US government doesn't set production quotas like OPEC does, which is why American oil output can fluctuate so dramatically compared to other nations. This also explains why the US doesn't worry too much about conserving its reserves. While countries like Saudi Arabia take a long-term approach, carefully managing how much they produce to make sure they don't run out too quickly, the US has taken the opposite approach. The priority has always been to maximize production and keep prices as low as possible. And there's a good reason for that. Unlike Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, the US economy isn't dependent on selling oil. Sure, oil is important, but the American economy is much more diversified. The US makes money from technology, finance, manufacturing, and 100 other industries. It doesn't need to rely on oil exports to keep the government running. That means the US can afford to produce more oil without worrying about keeping prices artificially high. But even though the US has embraced high production, there's still a major issue. It doesn't produce the same kind of oil that its refineries are designed to process. Crude oil isn't all the same. There are different types, and the kind of crude that comes out of the ground in the US isn't always compatible with the refineries that process it. Most American refineries, particularly those in the Gulf of Mexico and on the East Coast, were built decades ago when the US was importing a lot of oil from places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. These refineries were designed to handle heavy crude oil, which is thick, dense, and has a high sulfur content. The problem is most of the oil that's now being produced in the US, especially from shale formations, is light, sweet crude. This type of oil is less dense, has lower sulfur content, and is easier to refine into products like gasoline. But since many American refineries weren't built to process this kind of oil efficiently, much of it gets exported to other countries that have the right kind of refineries. Meanwhile, the US still needs heavy crude to keep its refineries running, which is why it continues to import oil from countries like Canada and Venezuela. This creates a strange situation where the US exports millions of barrels of oil per day, while also importing millions of barrels per day from other countries. To put it simply, the US doesn't just produce and consume oil, it trades it. The oil market is global, and refineries need the right type of crude to function efficiently. Since US refineries weren't originally built to handle the type of oil being extracted today, the country has to export the oil it produces and import the oil it actually needs. There have been discussions about updating American refineries to handle more light crude, but there are two big challenges. First, upgrading refineries is extremely expensive. These facilities are massive, complex systems, and reconfiguring them to handle different types of oil requires billions of dollars in investment. Second, there's the issue of long-term demand. With the world moving toward renewable energy, financial institutions are becoming more hesitant to fund fossil fuel projects. If demand for oil starts declining over the next few decades, investing billions into upgrading refineries might not be worth it. So for now, the US continues this strange balancing act, producing more oil than any other country while still relying on foreign imports. It's a paradox that exists because of the unique way the US oil industry has evolved over time. Unlike OPEC nations, the US doesn't try to control prices or limit production. And unlike some oil-rich countries, it doesn't have reserves big enough to last for centuries. Instead, the US oil industry is driven by market forces, technology, and the realities of refining. And as we'll see in the next part of this video, this dynamic has led to some unexpected consequences, both for the US and for the global oil market as a whole. Even though the US is the largest oil producer today, it wasn't always this way. In fact, if we go back just a few decades, America's relationship with oil looked very different. Understanding how the US went from an oil-hungry nation to an oil-producing powerhouse helps explain why, even today, the country remains deeply connected to foreign oil markets. In the early 1900s, oil wasn't the critical resource it is today. Most of the world was still running on coal, and while petroleum had started being used for things like lamps and heating, there wasn't an urgent demand for it. That all changed with the rise of the automobile. As more and more people started driving, the demand for oil skyrocketed. Suddenly, oil wasn't just a commodity, it was a necessity. During this period, the US had plenty of domestic oil. States like Texas, Oklahoma, and California were rich in oil reserves, and America was actually one of the world's largest oil exporters. By 1914, the US was producing nearly 70% of the world's total oil supply. But then, everything changed with World War I. The war was the first time oil became a strategic military asset. Unlike coal, which required large storage spaces and infrastructure, oil was easier to transport and could be used in tanks, planes, and battleships. The US Navy, recognizing the importance of oil, started securing foreign supplies from places like Mexico and the Caribbean. But this plan ran into serious problems when German U-boats started targeting American oil shipments, disrupting the country's supply chain. This crisis made one thing clear: oil wasn't just a valuable resource, it was essential to national security. The U.S. government responded by pushing for increased domestic oil production. This led to a boom in American oil drilling, with companies racing to find new reserves across the country. At the same time, other nations also began realizing the power of oil. European powers, including Britain and the Netherlands, started expanding their oil operations overseas. Companies like Shell and British Petroleum were set up to extract oil from the Middle East, reshaping global energy politics in the process. By the 1920s and 1930s, oil had become one of the most important resources in the world, and the U.S. was still leading the charge. However, there was a growing realization that America's domestic oil reserves wouldn't last forever. Even though the U.S. had plenty of oil at the time, some policymakers and industry experts started raising concerns about long-term supply. This concern led to a shift in strategy. Instead of relying solely on domestic oil, the U.S. started looking for cheaper foreign sources. The logic was simple: why use up America's own reserves when other countries had an abundance of oil that could be imported at a lower cost? This is when the U.S. first became dependent on foreign oil, and the real turning point came in the late 1930s when Arabian nations started drilling. The Middle East, which today is known for its massive oil wealth, was barely on the radar back then. But that all changed when American and British oil companies started investing in exploration efforts across the region. One of the biggest breakthroughs happened in 1938 with the discovery of the Dammam oil field in Saudi Arabia. This was the first major oil find in the country, and it completely changed the game. Saudi Arabia, along with other Middle Eastern nations, quickly became a major player in the global oil market. They had massive reserves, and thanks to their geographic location, they could extract and refine oil much cheaper than anywhere else in the world. As Middle Eastern nations ramped up production, the U.S. saw an opportunity. By importing cheap oil from the Middle East, the U.S. could preserve its own reserves for future use. This decision laid the foundation for America's long-term reliance on foreign oil. But as the global oil market became more competitive, something interesting started happening. In the early days, Middle Eastern nations were happy to sell their oil at competitive prices. But as competition increased, first from the Soviet Union, then from Western countries, these nations started seeing their profit margins shrink. That's when they decided to take control. In 1960, a group of major oil-producing countries got together and formed OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Their goal was simple: control oil production to keep prices stable and ensure that member countries could maximize their profits. OPEC operated like a cartel, setting production limits and adjusting supply to influence global oil prices. If prices were too low, they would cut production. If prices were too high, they would increase supply to stabilize the market. This gave OPEC enormous power over the global economy, and for a long time the U.S. had no choice but to play along. By the 1970s, U.S. dependence on foreign oil had grown to the point where it became a national security issue, and that's when the oil crisis hit. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the U.S. backed Israel in its conflict against an Arab coalition led by Egypt and Syria. In retaliation, OPEC member states, many of which were Arab nations, decided to cut off oil exports to the United States. This was a complete disaster for the U.S. economy. Almost overnight, oil prices skyrocketed, and the country was thrown into an energy crisis. Gas stations ran out of fuel, prices surged, and Americans faced long lines just to fill up their tanks. It was a wake-up call that exposed just how vulnerable the U.S. had become to foreign oil suppliers. In response, President Richard Nixon announced a plan called Project Independence. The goal was to reduce America's reliance on foreign oil by boosting domestic production and investing in alternative energy sources like nuclear power. The government also imposed price controls on petroleum products, hoping to stabilize the market. But while these efforts made some impact, they didn't completely solve the problem. In fact, in some ways, they made things worse. The price controls, while helpful in the short term, ended up discouraging investment in oil production, which only deepened America's reliance on foreign imports. Despite the crisis, U.S. oil dependency didn't go away. The global economy had become too interconnected, and the U.S. continued to rely on OPEC nations for its energy needs. Even today, decades later, America's relationship with foreign oil remains complicated. Since 2008, the U.S. has become the world's top oil producer, largely thanks to advancements in fracking and horizontal drilling. But despite producing more oil than ever before, the country still imports millions of barrels per day. The reason for this comes down to refining capacity, economic strategy, and the ongoing influence of global oil markets. The oil crisis of the 1970s was a turning point that forced the U.S. to rethink its energy strategy. It led to the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which serves as an emergency stockpile in case of another supply shock. It also pushed for more investment in domestic oil production, which eventually contributed to the fracking revolution that made the U.S. the top producer today. But even with these efforts, the U.S. never fully achieved energy independence. Instead, it became part of a global oil system where production, refining, and trade all work together in a delicate balance. Even though the U.S. is the largest oil producer in the world, it still imports millions of barrels of oil every day. That might sound like a contradiction, but it actually makes perfect sense when you break down how the oil industry works. It's not just about how much oil a country produces, it's also about what kind of oil it produces, where it gets refined, and how global markets influence trade. A big part of the reason the U.S. continues to import oil is because of the way its refineries were built. Refineries are the facilities that take crude oil and turn it into usable products like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil. But not all crude oil is the same. There are different types, and refineries are designed to handle specific kinds of crude. In the U.S., many refineries, especially the ones along the Gulf Coast and East Coast, were originally built to process heavy crude oil. This type of oil is thick, dense, and has a high sulfur content. It requires more processing, but refineries that are set up for it can produce a wide range of valuable products. For decades, the U.S. imported heavy crude from places like Venezuela, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, because that's what these refineries were designed to handle. But here's where the problem comes in. The oil that the U.S. now produces domestically, particularly from shale formations, is mostly light, sweet crude. This type of oil has a lower density, contains less sulfur, and is generally easier to refine. The problem is that many American refineries weren't designed to handle large amounts of it efficiently. So instead of refining all of its own oil, the U.S. exports a huge chunk of the light crude it produces to other countries that have the right refineries for it. At the same time, it continues to import heavy crude because that's what its existing refineries are best at processing. It's a trade-off that has developed over decades, and changing it isn't as simple as flipping a switch. There's been talk about upgrading American refineries to handle more light crude, but that's easier said than done. For one, these refineries are massive, complex facilities that cost billions of dollars to modify. And in an era where governments and corporations are increasingly investing in renewable energy, getting funding for large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure projects is becoming more difficult. This refining mismatch is one of the key reasons the U.S. exports around 1/3 of its total oil production while still relying on imports. But there's another reason why the U.S. trades oil on the global market: because it can. Unlike countries in OPEC, where oil production is tightly controlled by the government, the U.S. operates on a free market system. Private companies drill for oil, sell it to the highest bidder, and make decisions based on profit, not national policy. If an American oil company can get a better price by selling its crude to Europe or Asia, it will do that rather than selling it domestically. At the same time, refineries in the U.S. buy the cheapest crude they can find, regardless of where it comes from. This is why, even though the U.S. is a top oil producer, it still finds itself tied to global oil markets. Oil isn't just about how much you produce. It's about what type of oil you produce, how your refineries are set up, and how prices fluctuate on the international market. A big part of the U.S.'s production boom in recent years has been thanks to fracking. Fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, is a technique that allows oil and gas to be extracted from rock formations that were previously too difficult to access. It's what made the U.S. the world's leading oil producer, and without it, American production would be significantly lower. Fracking has been a game changer for the industry, but it also comes with major drawbacks. The environmental impact of fracking has been a hotly debated issue, with concerns about water contamination, methane emissions, and even an increase in earthquake activity in certain areas. Fracking requires enormous amounts of water, and the chemicals used in the process have raised concerns about long-term environmental damage. Despite these concerns, fracking has made the U.S. more energy independent than ever before. It's also had a major impact on global oil prices. By flooding the market with oil, U.S. production has helped keep prices lower than they otherwise would be. But this also creates a vulnerability. If oil prices drop too much, fracking becomes less profitable. Unlike conventional oil production, which can still be profitable at lower prices, fracking requires a much higher break-even point. Most shale oil producers need prices to be between $40 and $50 per barrel to remain profitable. If prices dip below that, many companies are forced to slow down production or even shut down operations entirely. This is exactly what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. When global demand for oil collapsed, prices plummeted, and American oil companies took a massive financial hit. Some drillers were forced to shut down wells, and in some cases, companies even had to pay buyers to take oil off their hands because storage facilities were overflowing. The pandemic exposed just how fragile the U.S. oil industry can be. Even though the country produces more oil than any other nation, its energy security is still dependent on the stability of global markets. If prices crash, domestic production slows down. If there's a supply disruption somewhere else in the world, prices spike, affecting American consumers. This raises another important question. Should the U.S. stop exporting oil altogether? Some argue that if the U.S. kept all of its oil for domestic use, gas prices could be lower. In theory, restricting exports would mean more oil available for Americans, which could help reduce costs at the pump. But in reality, it's not that simple. For one, oil is a global commodity. Even if the U.S. stopped exporting crude, that wouldn't necessarily stop prices from fluctuating based on global events. If there's a supply disruption in the Middle East, or if OPEC decides to cut production, prices would still rise, affecting American consumers. Second, the U.S. oil industry relies on exports to stay profitable. If American companies weren't allowed to sell their oil on the global market, many of them would struggle financially, leading to lower production and potential job losses in the sector. And finally, restricting exports wouldn't solve the refining issue. U.S. refineries would still need heavy crude, and if imports were restricted, the refining capacity in the country would suffer, leading to possible shortages of gasoline and other petroleum products. The reality is, as long as oil remains a crucial part of the energy landscape, the U.S. will continue to be both a major producer and a major importer. The industry is shaped by a complex mix of economic, technological, and geopolitical factors that make true energy independence difficult to achieve. Looking ahead, the future of the U.S. oil industry is uncertain. The world is gradually shifting toward renewable energy, and while oil isn't going away anytime soon, its role is likely to change. Investment in electric vehicles, wind, solar, and battery storage is increasing, which means that over time, demand for oil could decline. But for now, oil remains the backbone of the global economy. The U.S. may be the largest oil producer, but its reliance on the international market isn't going anywhere. The decisions made in the coming years, whether to invest in refinery upgrades, expand fracking, or move toward alternative energy sources, will determine the country's energy future. This definitely won't be the last time we talk about the complexities of American oil. So if you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more deep dives into the world of energy, economics, and global politics.